Welcome, everybody. I'm Ed Levin, Director of the Center on Addiction and Behavior Change, part of Duke Institute on Brain Sciences, DIBS. I'm showing with a kind of a philosophy talk about the causality and responsibility and drug addiction. Christine Tu, who is a clinician in the psychiatry department, talk about her work on the front lines with addiction. Sandra Comer from Columbia is going to be not coming here, but will be virtually here talking about her work with opioids. And then Roy Stein, who was a longtime Duke faculty member and now is working at UNC, is going to be talking about his work with opiate use disorder at UNC. If you have any suggestions for seminar speakers for next semester, I used to say, yeah, we do have a budget to get people to travel from outside. That's no longer necessary. I assume we're going to be continuing on with this in the spring. And so if you have suggestions, if you'd like to speak, please let me know. I'll put you on the schedule. Okay, so now I just wanted to say a word or two about our symposium on Friday, September 25th. This is in collaboration with the TRI Prevention 2020 program, and then the Substance Use Prevention with Equity, a community neuroscience-based approach. And so here we're going to be having a variety of folks from academia, from government, and from the community action groups, starting at 8:30. And you have to register, and the link will be in the chat box for that. And then the mayor is going to speak, community activists are going to speak, as well as Josh Stein, our esteemed North Carolina Attorney General, is going to be giving a keynote. And then we'll have a variety of speakers, including people from Duke and other academic institutions, as well as the community activist group. We'll have Kate Daniels, who spoke in our series a couple of years ago, is going to speak about her poetry and her personal experiences and family members with substance abuse problems. And then we'll have a discussion at the end. So really looking forward to this collaboration with Durham and community efforts to abate drug addictions, particularly among adolescents. So now I wanted to introduce today's speaker, is Dr. Rick Hoyle, who is in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience and a professor in that department. And he's also director of the Center for the Study of Adolescent Risk and Resilience. And he's going to speak to us today about conceptual and statistical considerations for deciding what to target with behavior change interventions. Rick?
Yeah, thank you, Ed. It's good to be with you. I'm sorry we can't all be in a room together. You know, the CABC I see as a sister center to the center I direct, which is a NIDA-funded center in which we study resilience and risk among adolescents. So the talk today, I apologize for the length. The title is, I think, on the one hand, fairly abstract, but on the other hand, what I would argue, highly practical. That is, it involves thinking about what it is that one wants to change, and in a nutshell, is it changeable? And which I would argue is a question we don't often ask. In fact, I would suggest that we often mount efforts to change things without ever considering whether the thing we're trying to change is in fact changeable. And I'll suggest to you that some of that is a statistical question. That is it possible to show an effect if our intervention is successful? Some of it is conceptual. That is, does it make good sense to think about potentially trying to move what it is that we want to move? Just briefly to acknowledge support and collaboration on this project. The different pieces I'll show you are funded in different ways by different groups. NIDA is the primary funder of this work. And much of the work was done in collaboration, virtually all of it with Aaron Davison, who's the associate director of the center, with me, and then Hannah Moshantz, who now is in a postdoc up at Wisconsin-Madison in an addiction research center. I belong to a group that is focused on trying to create behavior change and to try to do it in ways particularly that are enduring. That is, can you get people to do things that are not only in their own best interest, but for example, with reference to the current pandemic, that are generally in the best interest of everyone concerned? And can you get them to do that in effect without sort of heavy-handed supervision? That is, you can create enduring change. So that's sort of the mindset that I'm bringing to this sort of conversation about a behavior change and how it might work. So the target then is behavior. One conceivable way we could change behavior is to operate directly on it. Honestly, in adults, that's virtually impossible. In children, we in fact sometimes, we might say, make them do what we'd like them to do. But this notion of coercion and direct effect on behavior is really not one that's available to us. So alternatively, what we need to find and what we intervene on typically are what I might call levers or drivers. These are things that are upstream a bit from the behavior itself. And if they change, we would anticipate to some degree that the behavior will change as well. And the beauty of these drivers, I'll suggest to you, is that often they're somewhat nonspecific. So in changing them, we may have collateral benefits that go beyond the specific behavior we're trying to move other behaviors as well. So it's often the case then that interventions are designed not with specific reference to the behavior, but with respect to the lever, or what we might even call the mediating mechanism that is at play. So what might those drivers or levers look like? Well, one possible place to consider intervening, and in so doing change behavior, is the environment. And if you're familiar with the popular notion of nudges, those are very much oriented toward small changes, oftentimes changes that aren't even recognizable to the people they're designed to affect, that ultimately will downstream cause people to make different choices, for example. And there's some very compelling data about these small nudges within the environment that ultimately lead to potentially large changes in behavior, at least across populations, if not within individuals. Alternatively, we could look to characteristics of the person. That is, what is it that people carry with them, so to speak, that is relevant to the behavior that we want to change? And then how do we move that? And there are different ways to think about what that might involve. Broadly speaking, we could call them interventions, but they could be everything from behavioral focused interventions to pharmaceutical type interventions, all sorts of interventions we can imagine, even family oriented interventions. So where I want to focus today, and this is sort of my training and the focus of my research program, is on things about the person. And I want to suggest to you, if our focus is enduring behavior change, that's where we really want to focus. What are things about people that are subject to change that can lead to behavior change that we wish to produce? I'll just note, I'm not dismissing the environment as important, just suggesting that we don't always have control over the environment. People move through time and space, in and out of environments, and therefore effects that require environmental nudges don't always work. So what kinds of behaviors might we want to change? So in effect, I want to talk you through sort of two case studies of how I think about this idea of levers and things that could be moved, and addressing the question to my own satisfaction about whether they're movable. So the idea here is we assume that these are things that we have found an association with things about people. And the question then is, given that we know that those characteristics of people are related to these behaviors, can we demonstrate that this is a causal connection so that if we can somehow change that feature of the person, we can change their behavior? So sort of two broad classes of behaviors I'll sort of focus on, and that will lead me then to think of two characteristics of people that might matter, and then to the question of, can those characteristics of people be changed? One is a class of behaviors we might call overconsumption. or unwise consumption. And you see the sorts of things that fall in that category. Certainly that third bullet is of interest to my center, to my funder, and to the CABC as well. A somewhat different set of behaviors I want to focus on is kind of a second case study, perhaps as relevant as it's ever been, this notion of can we somehow deal with what seems to be mounting incivility, and in particular, incivility around political views, and particularly as the election season's coming on. So with regard to the first one, this is my own research program, in fact, I would suggest to you one potential lever, that is one characteristic of people that we can demonstrate is clearly correlated with these behaviors is self-control. So the question I'll pose to you and that we'll talk through in just a moment and look at some data about is self-control changeable? Is it a characteristic of people that can be changed with the anticipation that if we change it, that is, if we raise it, will we reduce overconsumption in these categories? As it relates to incivility, I'll touch briefly on a newer construct that my group now is spending actually quite a lot of time on because it turns out to be quite relevant to the current pandemic, is intellectual humility. Is it possible that some incivility that we see is attributable to the fact that people in effect lack humility in terms of what they know and what they assume to be true about the world? So let's focus on self-control to start, and I'll frame a question in the way I tend to think about it, because ultimately we're going to do studies that involve measurement. So one way to frame the question is, when I give someone a measure of self-control and I make use of their score, what can I infer about the construct from the behavior of those scores in research? So I want to give you three possibilities for what self-control measures measure, each one with different implications for how we would think about how one might intervene to move that and to produce behavior change that we care about. So one possibility is that self-control, as we typically measure it, operates more or less like a personality trait. Why might we think that is true? Well, dominant models of personality, what we call structural models, clearly have threads of self-control running through them. Here I'm showing you just a set of what are called facets from perhaps the most widely used measure of structural personality. And you can see the different traits that collectively would correspond to self-control. So thinking now about what we might believe to be true about personality traits, if in fact self-control were a personality trait. Well, there are two schools of thought on this. There's the classic belief that essentially by adulthood, by young adulthood even, one's personality is more or less set, and that in fact it's a stable characteristic of the person. That is, cross-situationally, I might expect you to behave in ways that reflect the same level of standing on a given personality trait. Interestingly, in recent years, it has become more and more clear that personality, in fact, can change. There are certain kinds of changes, some of which would be useful to think about from an intervention point of view, others which would not. We know, for example, there's substantial normative change. That is, as people get older, they become more conscientious, they become less neurotic, and that sort of change is useful to know and understand. Doesn't help us very much from an intervention point of view. We also know that people differ in how much their personality can change or does change over time. But the thing we know in that case is that for people for whom personality changes, it tends to be in response to major life events, major work experiences, and therefore it really isn't the sort of target of what would be typical interventions. One interesting feature, by the way, in this sort of spirit of enduring change is that once personality changes, it rarely reverses. That is, as people become more conscientious, they don't revert back to some stable state that was set early in life, but rather they stay where they are. So to stay with the theme of the talk then, if we view self-control as typically measured like a personality trait, it doesn't seem like a very reasonable target of intervention to produce change in behavior as it relates, for example, to overconsumption. Alternatively, we could conceptually view what a self-control measure captures as a skill. That is, people have either inherent to their personality or as a function of things they've learned, they're able to execute behaviors that reflect good self-control. This implicitly is a notion of the construct that a number of perspectives assume. For example, looking at that third bullet, if you know much about the literature, especially that aspect of the literature that is influenced by economic models, you'll have heard self-control-like qualities referred to as soft skills or non-cognitive skills or 21st century skills. So the question then becomes, now this is beginning to sound like something that we could move. And then the question becomes, if it's a skill, what sort of interventions change skills? What do we know about skill development? Turns out we know a fair amount about the development of skills. So from an intervention perspective, we're actually in a pretty strong position to consider interventions that would produce behavioral change in overconsumption. Learning, repetition, automation. I'll say more about that third bullet momentarily. Thirdly, and alternatively, it may be that what a self-control measures is really people's self-efficacy beliefs about their ability to control their own behavior, right? That is, it's possible that they have a capacity to do more than they think they can do, or in fact, they think they can do more than they can, but the point is it's a belief that the measure is picking up on. These are some items from a standard measure of the construct, and I would suggest to you that really those first three are pretty well-worded measures of efficacy, right? My own judgment that I am good at resisting temptation, or that my own judgment is that I wish I had more self-discipline. Certainly there are items that get at more of simply describing who I am, but there's a very strong flavor of self-efficacy beliefs in a typical measure of self-control. Well, as with skill, if we believe it's about self-efficacy, we know a lot about how to change self-efficacy. So if we were thinking about self-control as a lever to reduce overconsumption, then the kinds of interventions we would do are the kinds of interventions that elevate efficacy beliefs as they relate to self-control, giving people mastery experiences, exposing them to models, giving them experiences that increase essentially their confidence that they can control their behavior. One thing that self-control is sometimes believed to represent is willpower. That is an inherent characteristic of the person that reflects something about sort of their strength of will, as it were, which isn't that different from a personality kind of view. And I'll just note that we have a fair amount of data now suggesting that clearly this is not what self-control as typically measured really is. That in fact, if you look at what measures of self-control correlate with, they correlate with a basic set of strategies that people who score high on these scales routinely exercise. In fact, these have been captured very nicely in a recent paper by Angela Duckworth and colleagues on sort of strategies to behavior change that use the avenue of self-control. In particular, for example, just to give you a notion of how this might work, for example, that second bullet of strategic avoidance. We find in our own work that that is a quality that people who are good at self-control are good at. And if overconsumption is your problem, then avoidance is an important feature of reducing overconsumption. So just a little bit of data just to show you some of what we find in our own work that is relevant to this question of whether self-control is something that could be a focus of an intervention, both conceptually and statistically. So first I'll talk a little bit about how we define it and how my group has defined it and why I believe a broader definition is advantageous if we want to think about it as a lever to behavior change. And then what change looks like, both normative change and person-specific change. So we have, I'm posing this as really a rhetorical question. The answer for me is clearly yes. I will tell you that historically, the belief has been that self-control is really nothing more than self-restraint. That is, if people are good at stopping themselves from doing something, then we infer they are good at self-control. There are many behaviors, however, that we believe reflect self-control that don't involve simply stopping oneself from doing something. For example, wearing a mask when I'm around other people is not an issue of self-restraint. It's an issue of making myself do something that I might not initially be inclined to do, that I might even find unpleasant to do. So we have offered a broader definition of self-control, and I'll just quickly note we have a measure, and I've highlighted kind of key phrases. So that first box on your left is the classic self-restraint box, that people who score high on that aspect of self-control are good at inhibiting their behavior. But the behavior I just described to you fits in our domain of what we like to call initiation. That is the ability to do things that I'm not initially inclined to do. So we might, in lay terms, talk about making ourselves do something. And then we also believe there's an aspect of self-control, especially when the behavior involves carrying on, when carrying on can become unpleasant. That involves what we call continuation. That is, it's not just beginning a behavior. It's not just sort of starting a diet. It's sticking with it and seeing it through to the end, especially when the going gets tough. So our belief is, and we've got a lot of data now to show that if you fit this to models of people's data, you get a nice higher order latent variable that would be classic self-control, but it's a function of really these three kind of forms of self-control that we see across people. Just to give you a touch of data, there's a great deal of data I could show you. This is a set of correlations that specifically highlight the difference between self-control by inhibiting one's behavior and self-control that involves initiating behavior. And no surprises there really, other than you can see, for example, that people who drink too much, who experience hangover the next day, or people who are low in self-control by inhibition, people who exercise regularly, who do well in school, are people who score higher on self-control by initiation. What about change in self-control? If it's a personality trait, or if it has the features of a personality trait, at most we would expect normative change, but we might really expect no change at all. For example, we might expect college students to turn up at campus with whatever steady state of self-control they have to bring. So I have some data here to share. I saw that Molly Weeks is on the call. Molly is very much involved in this work. This was a large study on which we followed university students across their 4 years of undergraduate study. We assessed their self-control twice a year, every year, which allows us then to ask, what does it look like across time? Of course, controlling for unreliability. A quick peek at some data, just again, trying to give you a flavor for whether we believe this is something that's a fixed quality of people, or it's a characteristic of people that changes and is subject to change. These are adjacent correlations. For example, the one across the top is the correlation between self-control measured at time 1 and self-control measured about 4 months later at time 2 to 3, etc. So time 1 to 2 is fall to spring. So we're in the same academic year. Time 2 to 3 is spring to the following fall. So now we're bridging, the summer takes place in between. One thing interesting about this pattern is, though the stability is quite high, I mean, there are two things to note: that over time, as they go from a first-year student to a fourth-year student, you can see these bars begin to get larger. That is, the correlation between assessments gets higher. But interestingly, it varies as a function of whether we're looking at it from fall to spring versus spring to fall. That is, and that's not a difference we would expect to see were it a trait, but clearly exposure and circumstances matter a great deal. And if people show up the following fall, at a different place than they were the prior spring. Another thing we're able to do in this large data set is compare self-control to other characteristics that we measured across the same period of time. So at time 1, we not only measured self-control, but we measured what are called the big 5 personality traits. And so what you're seeing here then, well, we measured these all again near the time that graduation took place. So we have 3.5-year stability assessments. And you can see, actually, perhaps to you anyway, this seems surprisingly high. So the correlation between student self-control when they arrived at campus versus 4 years later is, in this case, this line shows for self-control, almost 0.5. But interestingly, you can see all the bars for personality are higher, particularly extroversion and conscientiousness, which would be the closest personality trait to self-control. So this suggests that though it may share some features with personality, especially conscientiousness, self-control is not simply a personality trait. This is a rather busy, messy diagram that I'm about to bring some order to, but what you're seeing here is the 9 assessments of self-control spaced longitudinally across time along the bottom. Spacing was a little narrower at some points than others, so this is real spacing in terms of month. So this is student scores at each time point across all the time points. And we can fit these data, and we can ask, for example, if we fit them to a trajectory model, is that trajectory linear? Is it curvilinear? And if it's one or the other, does it tend to shade upwards over time or downwards? You can see, by the way, here's somebody who has a strong curvilinear pattern. You can see other people seem to sort of bounce up and down. Importantly, we would expect them to some degree because these measures are not perfectly reliable. So the question is, within what we might expect from unreliability, do we see any pattern of change? So if you fit these data to trajectory models, what you find is that a linear model fits exceptionally well, interestingly. Furthermore, what you find is that people change in different ways. For example, you can see here, this is time 1. So if we only measured student self-control when they arrived at college, this is the distribution we would see, and people would be rank ordered in a certain way as a function of where they fit within this distribution. But if you trace out different lines, what you see, for example, is here are 2 people who started at pretty much the same place, very, very close to the same score when they arrived, but they're very far apart by the time they leave university. One saw virtually no change at all. One saw a steady decline in self-control over time. Here you see 2 different people, again, getting more different as time goes by, but importantly, switching places, so that if we took their rank order at time 1, we would view this person as higher in self-control than this one, but over time, clearly, that switches. Why does that matter? Well, it turns out that if you look at the slope of that line as a variable, which you can do, you find actually that slope, here represented by the light blue bars, is more important as a predictor of certain outcomes in the study that we care about than people's actual standing when they arrived at Duke. So for example, the more positive people slope over time, the higher their well-being upon exit. And you can see that the more negative their slope over time, the greater their perceived stress. There's a bit of a causal direction question that we can't answer with these data, but you see the point here is that there's something about change that gives us insight into behavior. And when we're thinking about intervention, then change is what we're about. Real quickly, I'll show you some data that are on very, very short-term differences in self-control. A pair of studies, I'll only show you data from one in which we essentially assess people multiple times per day across, in each case, 2 weeks. The one I'll focus on is the second one. We assessed emerging adults 5 times a day across 14 days, and we asked them about inhibition, and initiation. And what I want to show you really here is just some summary data. What you're looking at is the overlay of 102 frequency distributions. And these are at the individual level. So for example, this is the distribution for a given person, their 70 assessments across 2 weeks' time. So you can see then if you take the middle view projected down, that would be their average state self-control across the 14 days. And you can see that if that's all you knew, you would know something, but what you would miss is the fact that there are substantially different shapes to these curves. That some people's distributions are quite flat and wide, other people's are fairly narrow and tall. And just some very quick data on this. There's substantial variability in variability. That is, some people are highly variable, other people not so much. The correlation between people's variability and their average score is virtually zero, which means then this is additional information we get by tracking their variability. And furthermore, and some other interesting things we could talk about at another time is that if you take the average of people's momentary scores, you might think that would equal their trait score, but it turns out it's fairly modestly correlated with it. So where do we end up with self-control? Well, just to summarize for now, and then I'll come back later to how we can think about it as a lever. We know that it's broader than self-restraint. It really is more about strategy use than the exertion of will. It continues to develop at least into early adulthood, for which we have data. And it varies from moment to moment, suggesting that things that are going on in the momentary space are affecting where people see themselves, perhaps in that self-efficacy space in terms of their ability to get things done or to not do something they wish not to do. All right, with that sort of behind us, now let's shift to a second case study. I'll just talk quickly and briefly about it before I come back and put these two together to make some general statements. So intellectual humility has become something of an emphasis by funding agencies lately, the idea being that some portion of behavior that we want to understand about humans is not in fact captured very well by standard measures. And I'll show you some data consistent with that in a moment. We've done a fair amount of that work here at Duke, my group and Mark Leary's group. And here I'm just giving you our formal definition. And then just to remind you, the idea here is we believe that intellectual humility, in fact, we have very good data to show that intellectual humility is correlated with these things. And these tend to be things that we wish to address in culture more broadly. So if in fact this relationship is causal, this becomes a lever. And then the question arises, is this something like self-control that can be moved or not? Just a little bit about intellectual humility, because it has a particular feature that is a bit different from self-control. The idea here, sort of operating on classic philosophy, is that people who are intellectually humble kind of sit at a golden mean on a continuum. On the lower side of that continuum is essentially intellectual servility, that is feeling inferior, feeling incapable of understanding and endorsing a point of view, certainly not a quality that we want to see in people. On the other end, and the one we perhaps fret more about, is an unwillingness to attend to and to consider other views, often accompanied by a lack of logical rigor. Lots of that, as you well know, around us in this day of time. So sitting in the middle of that is this construct of intellectual humility. And the idea here is that intellectual humility is a bit of a sweet spot between these two, which means then if we're thinking about changing intellectual humility, then we really have two potential sub-audiences to focus on, right? People who are intellectually arrogant, which is where we often would focus our attention. How do we pull them into this space so that they're willing to actually consider alternatives? And then people who are on the intellectually servile end, who we just simply want to think for themselves, right? To attend to information without relying on others to do it for them. So as with self-control, what we know about intellectual humility is based on how we measure it. We have a measure that is fairly widely used of the construct. Here are the items, just to highlight, you can see very clearly in the items what the construct is. You can see that we clearly are asking people if they would be willing to admit that they essentially don't know everything there is to know. They could be wrong. They're willing to consider the fact that some evidence is contrary to their beliefs. They might attend to new information. And in so doing, the attitude we would expect them to have is one that is willing to reconsider, to potentially accept, to explore. So the measure then is getting at a certain mindset, we might say, as it relates to what one holds to be true about the world. This is a very busy slide. The only thing I want to show you here is, in a sort of broad sense, these correlations are very modest to small, which means that, and many of these are characteristics that we might expect intellectual humility to be correlated with, and none of these correlations are alarmingly large, which leads us to believe we're in fact onto something that's new and different. Interestingly, to the first question I raised about self-control, fairly modest correlation with only one feature of personality. And it turns out to be the feature of personality that is sort of the least understood and studied of the five. So we can say almost at the outset that intellectual humility does not seem to function like a personality trait. It doesn't sort of fit into personality space. So more broadly speaking, then the question is, can it be changed? Before we go there, I'll just note that in addition to having the broad mindset that about whatever it might be, I might have more to learn, we've also asked the question, what about with respect to specific kinds of knowledge? For example, let's say that it concerns vaccines and getting vaccinations. Do I believe that I know all there is to know and therefore my mind is made up wherever I stand? Or do I believe I have more to learn, specifically as it relates to a novel virus, like, for example, the coronavirus? So we have a measure for that as well, and we tend to use these last three items as a short version of the scale that we can then give participants repeatedly to touch on different topics we might care about. Interestingly, what we find is the measure works equally well no matter what you ask people about. So if I ask you about how intellectually humble you are about politics, and I ask you about how intellectually humble you are about religion, this measure psychometrically works equally well. Surprisingly to us, and now replicated many times over, is that your scores on those tend to be modest, and between them tend to be modest as well. That is, it's possible that in general, I could have an attitude of intellectual humility, but with respect to any given particular topic, it may be that in fact I am relatively fixed in terms of my perspective. I just want to show you quickly these graphs to suggest to you that intellectual humility is in fact related to extremity. In other words, you might believe that people of a certain political persuasion or religious belief system tend to be more or less intellectually humble. What we find over and over, and I'll show you even more graphs that have a very similar shape here. And I'll just note that across the x-axis here, this is where people stand in terms of their religious beliefs. It goes all the way from firmly atheist to firmly a believer in God, without respect, by the way, to religious tradition. And then what the y-axis represents is intellectual humility with respect to one's religious beliefs. And what you're seeing is that at the extremes, people are low in intellectual humility. Here's just a random set of other characteristics. Curve's not quite as dramatic, but you see the same idea, that you get this curvilinear relationship. So what that suggests to us then is that intellectual humility is clearly associated with extremity. We also have data in the study I told you about earlier around intellectual humility. We didn't measure it on every occasion, but we measured it when students arrived at campus and as they were leaving. And we had a hypothesis that potentially being exposed via coursework and just generally living in an academic environment might change one's interaction with knowledge and one's sense of one's own understanding about things. In fact, I had this general hypothesis that intellectual humility would go up over time as I came to understand how little I knew about how the world actually works. What we actually find is if you again take into account unreliability and you calculate reliable change, there was fairly little movement in intellectual humility across the 4 college years. And only a small sliver of students actually increased in intellectual humility. In fact, more people declined in their intellectual humility than increased. So where does this leave us? We don't know as much about intellectual humility as we do about self-control, but we know it's only modestly correlated with personality, which suggests to us then that it perhaps doesn't operate like a trait, given that personality models are presumably exhaustive in terms of their characterization of personality. We know that it's highly variable across topic and issue. We know that it's modestly related with some variables that are related to good adjustment, which I didn't show you. And we also know it seems that it's not sensitive to knowledge acquisition. So let me now bring this all together. So the question that motivated the talk is, what are the prospects for enduring change that relies on characteristics of the person as drivers of the downstream behavior? And specifically, I use as examples 2 constructs that I've worked with, self-control and intellectual humility. Taking them in turn, what's the bottom line as it relates to self-control as we typically assess it and understand it? It's modestly correlated with personality, so that correlation or that stability that we see is moderate and increases in emerging adulthood, suggesting then that interventions around self-control might work better for late adolescents and emerging adults than they would for older adults. Taking a broader conceptualization adds features to the concept that then suggests interventions that might look different from those interventions if we only thought about it as self-restraint. It has, for example, if we were trying to bring about behavior change as it relates to health promoting behaviors, for example, like mask wearing and keeping distance. The way questionnaires tend to be worded and what we see in people's and the correlations with other behaviors suggests that self-efficacy may be at the heart at it. And the beauty of that is we know quite a lot about how to move self-efficacy, and that suggests then interventions that would potentially move this driver and therefore move downstream behavior. And we see substantial moment-to-moment variability in state self-control. I'll say more if there's time about what that might mean for all this. Shifting to intellectual humility, again, we see it's largely uncorrelated with personality. It can be thought of in general and specific forms, and the correlation between those two is relatively modest. And that suggests, by the way, skipping to this 4th bullet, and our inference at this point is that interventions might be better tailored at the topic level. That is, rather than trying to change broadly an individual's beliefs about their own knowledge about the world, it seems more sensible to target people's specific beliefs about their knowledge and understanding as it relates to specific topics related to the behaviors I wish to change. At this point, however, there's been relatively little work, so there's much more work to do. But if we believe, as I do, that it's something like a mindset, then you well know perhaps that there are interventions for mindsets. Moreover, a mindset is not that far from an attitude, and we know a fair amount about how to change attitudes. So in that sense, then, there's reason to believe that, like self-control, to the extent that it's a self-efficacy construct, we might believe intellectual humility could be changed. So the bottom line then is each of these constructs seems to be a good candidate as a lever for changing, on the one hand, overconsumption by changing self-control, and on the other hand, changing incivility by changing intellectual humility. And I will stop with that. Thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions you have.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was fascinating. And now we do have some time for discussion. I wanted to lead off with a question, kind of contrasting the approaches of neuroscience and psychology. So in neuroscience and broadly in medicine in general, or science in general, there's a kind of reductionistic approach in terms of determining the causes, the underlying causes of some phenomena. And so I just wonder if we're sending people mixed messages when we're trying to get people to change behavior, whether it's health enhancing behavior or health impairing behavior like addiction, that oh, your brain is diseased in a certain way, and there's the nucleus accumbens is abnormal, and you're addicted to this particular drug. And where does that leave the person's self-efficacy? So is there some kind of deconditioning we need to do to improve the self-efficacy of people who are kind of buying into this notion that their brain is driving their behavior?
Well, that's an interesting question. There's a lot I could say about it just based on our own experience. I will say, by the way, we did some work some years ago, Phil Costanzo and Scott Utel and I did, looking at the correspondence between kind of self-reported levels of certain concepts that might matter. In our particular case, it was impulsivity, which is another candidate for intervention, and looking at it from the sort of behavioral self-report level and the neurobiological level, and found almost no correlation between the brain systems that seem to drive impulsive behavior and people's performance on a task, a behavioral task designed to capture impulsivity, and their self-reports about their own impulsivity. So it seems like the two aren't tightly connected to one another. That is, people's beliefs and understanding of their own tendencies and sort of the underlying neurobiology of it. The other thing I guess I would say is that there's sort of more than one path to some of these well, let me back up and say, if you believe as I do that self-control is a strategy, or really a family of strategies, then the feeling is, regardless of what your hardware might be like, there are strategies that can work for you, strategies that can be learned, and strategies that use different systems so that for you, this strategy, so for me, avoidance might be the strategy that works, and sort of how I'm wired makes it easy enough for me to do that. For other people, a different strategy that is more consistent with how they're sort of wired, I might say, works better. So that leads then, I guess, Ed, to the general message that you aren't a slave, so to speak, to the sort of underlying neurobiology of it, that the sort of construct in its sort of behavioral form takes on enough manifestations that there are ways to get around, so to speak, any limitations.
Well, thank you. Now, I want to take a chance to thank Tyler Lee for managing all of this tech, and then also, given the format that we're in with Zoom, if people can use the raise hand feature, and then we can unmute them to.
Okay. Thanks, Rick. That was a really just fascinating talk. And the part on intellectual humility really got, especially across the college years, really got me to thinking about how often we as professors demonstrate intellectual humility. And I'm wondering if there's a way to get at that environmental component. Like, are there disciplines or colleges with different philosophies, or has this changed across the decades so we can see if there are places where colleges do a better job of imparting intellectual humility? Or because right now it feels like a lot of colleges get that knowledge in your head and pass those tests. So I wonder if that's right. Environmentally.
Yeah, I have two thoughts there. One is more broadly the environment that is sort of established and maintained by the college itself, and the other is, and where I thought you might be going, is across disciplines. That is, is it possible that in certain disciplines there is a tendency to essentially latch on to ideas and hold them tight, and others where you're always questioning. In our data, we found very little relationship at all between intellectual humility and what students majored in. So we were surprised there. I'll just say that one of the philosophers that works in the group that we were sort of funded to do work on intellectual humility with started a school. It's actually a high school, but the entire school is built around the intellectual virtues, beyond just intellectual humility, curiosity, and other ones. And his feeling is, in fact, that he has clearly demonstrated that one can figure out what you would do if that were your target. If you wanted to make people more intellectually humble, we know how you would present subject matter to them. We know how you would test them. For example, your point about there's only one right answer, and if you get that answer, then you've got it. If you don't, you don't. So I haven't seen it at the college level, but at the high school level, the feeling is yes, environment matters.
And so what are those environmental conditions that create?
Oh, gee, I'm gonna, yeah, I think some of it, is very little individual work, for example. So people are then routinely sort of forced to think through their perspective in concert with other people who may disagree with them, who are encouraged to disagree with them. So I think there's that piece to it, which also presses people to learn how to operate in a place where not everybody agrees. And I would think as college professors, those of us on the call, I would think that's something we can very much do, right? Strongly encourage people to disagree and, make that acceptable and make it clear that in the end, we can't be sure in many cases what the right answer is. And diversity of opinion is acceptable.
Yeah, thank you.
Are there other questions people have? I have another one.
At the moment, I don't see any hands raised, so go ahead.
I had a question. I'm sure there's been a lot of work into radicalization, and I'm old enough to remember the term brainwashing, and how does that fit into this idea of self-efficacy or lack of self-efficacy, and how does someone fall into that, and how might you be able to get them out of it, and whether it's extreme political views or something like overeating or drug abuse?
Yeah, wow, I could be famous if I could sort that one out. But I mean, I have some ideas. One thing we've looked at with intellectual humility is, do people vary in what they base their understanding of the world on as a function of how high or low they are? Right. And so people who tend to be higher on intellectual humility tend to base their understanding and their sort of development of ideas around sort of personal exploration, usually focused on credible sources, right? In other words, their information is coming from places that are not, presumably, that are factual and reasonably unbiased. People who are low on intellectual humility tend to base their information on we often find, for example, anecdotes, the views of friends and family, which often is, in fact, anecdotal, and in many cases, then sort of charismatic leaders who basically prescribe it. So the question would be, how do you get, at the end of the day, really, for me, the question is, how do you get people to think for themselves? Right? Because I would suggest that people who become radicalized are people who, in fact, don't. They're people who become highly influenced by the people they're around. And if you're able to create a little world in which everybody thinks the same, then nobody's motivated to think any differently. And then charismatic leadership.
Well, thank you very much. Are there any other, Larry?
Larry's got a question.
Actually, I have a comment. It took me a few minutes to figure out how to raise my hand. Sorry. I got it though. So I'm a physician and do a fair amount of clinical teaching, and also have had some pretty advanced training on teaching others or helping others train in teaching skills. And really one of the fundamental things that we try to get clinician educators to do is to acknowledge what they don't know or what they don't understand, and to be very explicit about it. And that's not a particularly well demonstrated behavior in academic medicine, I can assure you. But the idea being, if, you know, for a learner, if they're willing to talk about, well, I don't really understand that, or help me with this, or that's a point of confusion for me, we're going to be much more effective in teaching them. And then also when they are, you know, independent in practice and they're not a trainee anymore, you want people to be honest with themselves about where it is that they're weak or have a gap in their knowledge or skill set or whatever, and to actively seek that out. Physicians, certainly, I understand they go to medical conferences and tend to go to the talks on things they're already good at because it's kind of reinforcing and helps their egos. Well, really, they should be going to the things that are baffling and confusing and struggling through those. So I think this fits very nicely into this whole concept of intellectual humility, and I like that term, and I'm gonna use that now.
Yeah, I like that, Larry. And I think, Nicole, that really gets to some of what you were talking about how to do it. I would just say one interesting thing the philosophers really push that we work with is that, you know, coming at things in the way you describe is coming at them from a position of strength, not weakness, right? You could, in other words, I mean, certainly you could slide down that continuum towards servility, and that would be a problem. But there's a pretty wide space within intellectual humility to be willing to question even that I understand the world, but without sort of being willing then to be led by just whoever might tell me how I should think. So it's almost like it's a combination of, on the one hand, realizing there are many things I need to learn, and on the other hand, I'm willing to do what it takes. And it's that feature of intellectual humility that I'm willing to seek out information, alternative views, that sort of separates it from servility. And makes it more intellectual humility. But that's great. I like the way you do that. That's a good example.
It leads me to wonder if there's that component of creating emotional safety that Larry talked about. It's okay to be wrong. It's okay to own what you're not good at, because that's how we all get better. And if we could create that in political discourse, we go a long way.
Yeah, true.
Okay.
Classroom I can handle.
We should all have more intellectual humility, and in addition to the imposter syndrome, also avoid the imposer syndrome, I guess.
There you go.
So, okay, well, I want to thank you so much for a wonderful talk and a great discussion. And this is working out well with this new technology here. I wanted to invite everyone to return on September 9th for Scott Parnell, who's going to be talking to us about cannabinoids and alcohol and early development. And also wanted to especially urge people to register for the September 25th Substance Abuse Prevention with in an ethical way, a community and neuroscience-based approach. So again, I want to thank Tyler for the technical help, and Nicole for getting things together from the DIBS side, and Rick for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
Okay, thanks.
Bye, everybody.